City, and welcome back, everybody. Nice to see you all again. So, yeah, today I want to. Well, I'll try and recap a little bit about what we said yesterday, and then we'll try and take it further. Um, but before we do any of that, I thought we'd just start with just a few minutes of sitting, like 5 or 10 minutes of sitting, which I'll lead you into, and we're just going to become aware of our sense experience. So make sure that you're comfortable on a chair or however you're sitting, just sit comfortably. When you're sitting comfortably, let's start with a few deeper breaths. And particularly as you breathe out, having a sense of the weight of the body dropping down through the support under you, dropping into the ground. And see if you can become aware of sounds around you. My voice, of course, but any other sounds you can hear, inside or outside. Opening your awareness to sound. See if you can just let them be sounds without any commentary or words or labeling at all. And then bringing awareness into the body. An overall sense of the space occupied by the body. And becoming aware of the sensations of contact the body makes with the chair or the support and with the ground. Once again, see if we can have a direct experience of sensation of contact without any commentary or even an image of the body. Just noticing sensations of pressure, hardness, firmness, softness. You stay with the direct sensations. Can you really distinguish where the body ends and the chair or support begins? Or is there just sensation? And even though the eyes are closed, is there any visual impression, visual sensation, sort of flickering of light behind the closed eyelids? Or any other visual impression? Again, just direct visual sensation. And taste. Is there any sensation of taste in the mouth? And again, try not to label the experience, just experience it directly. And include any sense of smell. So becoming aware of the whole sensory field with all five senses and their sense impressions. And then broadening your awareness, your imaginative sense of all of us, wherever we are, doing this together. And then when you feel ready, coming out of the meditation, when you feel ready, opening your eyes. Okay, very good. So, yes, yesterday I was I started off talking sort of personally about um, my own sort of interest in the nature of consciousness. And although that sounds a bit of a grand way of putting it, but an interest in what's really going on. What is it to be alive? What's really going on in the world? That interest led me to, study physics at university, and that was an attempt to sort of understand the nature of reality from a science perspective. Um, but I think now looking back, that just wasn't very satisfying. Um, it wasn't very satisfying at the time, and looking back on it, I don't think that physics is going to be able to um, have a sort of comprehensive explanation for the nature of reality unless it takes account of consciousness. Uh, and if it were to take account of consciousness, in a way, it wouldn't be physics, because physics, almost by definition, assumes that the world is out there objectively. There's an objective existing world, and it studies it seemingly objectively, leaving out the subject, leaving out the subjective first person experience. It's trying to study something very, very objectively. And of course, what happens with modern physics, with quantum physics, particularly with quantum physics, but even with theories like relativity, what happens is that you reach the limits in physics of objectivity, or it feels like that anyway, and the subjective aspect seems to invade the objective. Um, so in quantum physics, particles seem to behave differently when observed. Uh, so what's going on there? It's like the subjective consciousness. Well, at least this is my interpretation. There are different interpretations, and I'm not going to go into interpretations of quantum physics, but maybe another time. But the from my interpretation, it's like the subjective is coming in to to this exploration. And that's because you can't really separate out subjective and objective. They're not really different. That's what Buddhism would say. Buddhism would say there's a field of experience, a field of consciousness, which has a subjective pole and an objective pole, but it's a unified field of consciousness. Anyway, I wasn't going to talk about that. I was trying to actually summarize what I said yesterday, but I've gone off on one. Uh, um, uh, anyway, I was trying to say that I think that we can't leave out, if we want to understand the nature of reality, we can't ignore uh, the nature of our own experience, which means looking at the nature of consciousness. And modern science would have us, sometimes science would have us believe that consciousness is, well, some scientists think that it's just the brain. It's the brain generates something called consciousness. I don't buy that. I don't buy that because um, I don't think it's a real explanation. Because how does a bunch of neurons, which are really just collections of atoms, how do they, even if they're arranged in a very complicated way, how does it generate, how do they generate the first person experience of seeing red, or of falling in love, or of feeling the sun on my skin? How does it, the actual first person experience of being alive in the world, how does a bunch of atoms create that? You can't, it's not an explanation. It's not really an explanation. This phenomenon of emergence doesn't really, I think, cut the mustard as an explanation. Um, but I think this notion of consciousness is primary. Now, certainly from a Buddhist perspective, it's primary. Buddhism would, perhaps later Buddhism particularly, would say that consciousness comes before matter. Consciousness is primary. It's not that the neurons and atoms generate consciousness. It's more that consciousness is primary, the primary reality. And this world of matter is emerging out of that in some way or other. That would be a more traditional way of seeing things. But yesterday, what I was saying is that consciousness has depth to it. It's in a way, if we think about that, it's sort of obvious. We have um, different sort of modes of consciousness, and what I was saying is that particularly if we meditate, you realize that after meditation, the world can look different, even though, say, your visual experience, the visual impressions are the same. Your eyes haven't literally changed and the visual impressions are the same, but somehow the mind has changed and the world looks more vivid. It can even look more radiant and more beautiful. And if you've been doing the metta bhavana, you can feel more connected, both with other beings, but even with inanimate objects. You can start to feel a certain sense of resonance with them. So that's an example of going deeper into consciousness and that having a transformative effect on experience. And then I was talking about the Prabhasara Sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha says this mind is luminous, this consciousness is luminous, but it's covered over with adventitious defilements, covered over with defilements that are extraneous. They're external to it. They're not intrinsic to it. And I was talking about how the mind is sometimes compared to the sky, the clear blue sky, vast, boundless, pristine, luminous, clear blue sky. But that the defilements that cover it over are like clouds. And we don't always see the blue sky. We don't experience always the luminosity because we are behind clouds or under clouds. And the defilements I was saying are the kleshas are there's emotional kind of defilements like greed and hatred, but self-centered emotions and all their variants. They are like clouds that cover over the luminosity. Um, but there's also cognitive defilements, delusions that cover over the luminosity. And the basic cognitive defilement, the basic delusion that is covering the luminosity is that there is a fixed and separate entity called me, somehow in here, in the subjective pole of experience. And that the world out there that I experience through the senses is objective just as it appears. It's really as it appears. And for common sense purposes, that kind of works. When we're going about ordinary life, that is an adequate approximation. It's an adequate model to function in ordinary life. The trouble is that we take that as literally true, as the deepest reality. And then we live in that clouded world, and we never experience consciousness as it truly is. We never experience the luminosity. I say never, but that's not true, because yesterday we were looking at our peak experiences where, as it were, the luminosity shines through. It breaks through. In a sense, it's always, and I'm talking poetically, always trying to break through. And in every moment, there's the potential for it to break through. But in a sense, in every moment, we cover it over again. We cover it over again. To use another metaphor, consciousness, the luminous mind, is boundless. It's vast. It's infinite, actually. It's unbounded. It's spacious. And what happens is that the defilements shrink it. They make it feel small. So let's just explore that a little bit more. When we're feeling positive, when we're feeling metaphor, when we're feeling content and yeah, happy, the mind is more expansive. And when we're feeling unhappy and I don't know, maybe depressed or anxious or angry, the mind feels, literally, it feels, our experience feels smaller. It feels like we've shrunk, contracted in on ourselves. Nod if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's good. So, and also when you close your eyes and we meditate, it doesn't feel like you're trapped in a few inches of your skull. It normally feels like there's more space than that in your consciousness. So consciousness has a quality of spaciousness to it. Now, the spaciousness that we're referring to isn't like external space. It's not like the external three-dimensional space that we normally think is the world. It's not like that. It's an inner spaciousness. It's not in external space. It's an inner spaciousness of mind. Yeah. And that inner spaciousness is potentially infinite. That's what I'm trying to say. Mind is infinite. The luminosity is also boundless. But we contract it. So we cover over the radiance and we contract the spaciousness. And we live in a small, darkened consciousness relative to how it could be. And it's the source of, sorry, that covering over and that shrinking is in a way the source of all our unsatisfactoriness in the world. It's because if we could experience the radiant luminosity more, it would be blissful and it would be full of metta. Luminosity is one way of talking about it. It's a kind of visual way of talking about it. But another way of talking about it would be metta. Metta and luminosity are synonymous. So it would be full of love and a sense that we're not separate. The separateness would have gone. We would see that actually underlying our ordinary experience of separateness, this radiant, luminous mind is it's below separateness or beneath separateness. It's not itself mine or yours. It is a universal mind, to use that word, within which all things arise. At the deepest possible level, we're not separate. We'd see that. And love, metta, would be the natural response. And yesterday we were talking a little bit about dukkha in the world and how best to help alleviate suffering in the world. And I was saying that, well, we can work at different levels, and working at a, a sort of socio-political level of engagement in the world and trying to help is one way. But the deepest possible way is for us to recognize this luminous, radiant mind and to live from it and to help others recognize it. Because if humanity could recognize this luminosity that in a way we're all part of, we would be transformed. It's like human beings would be on a different plane of existence. Uh, I believe that in a way, the world's problems are not going to be solved at their own level in the end. I think that we need a new consciousness, and it's a new consciousness that doesn't have um, the delusion of separateness and doesn't have the self-centeredness of greed and hatred. That is a consciousness based in metta, radiant and blissful. That's our birthright, and I do think that if more of us can experience more of that, we unleash, as it were, a force in the world. Because remember, consciousness isn't limited to the body. It has an effect. Yesterday, somebody was saying that when we are more positive, other people pick up on that. We affect the world around us. We affect other people around us. So Buddhism is trying to, in a way, look at the deepest possible transformation that's possible for a human being. That would be a transformation of our minds that would also transform our world and would have an effect on others around us. That's what the Buddha tried to do. And yes, he didn't transform everybody's mind, but he had a sufficient impact on the world so that all these centuries later, all these millennia later, we are still benefiting from his realization under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago. So that's a bit of a recap and a bit more about what we were talking about yesterday. And I was saying that, and we were exploring in groups, glimpses of this radiance in those peak moments. And the trouble is that most of the time, if you're not practicing, if you don't understand the nature of mind, then those peak experiences are easily forgotten. They seem to come from nowhere. We don't reflect on what are the conditions that led to them, and we don't base our life around them. Whereas as a Buddhist, what we're trying to do is systematically base our life around the highest experiences and have confidence in them, and even have confidence that there's more than we've yet experienced, even in those peak experiences, and to orientate the whole of our being around them and our life around them, and to systematically tread a path that will reveal the luminosity ever more. Well, first of all, ever more frequently, and then, as it were, more continuously. Okay, so today I want to start looking at another model for consciousness that comes from a few centuries later than the Buddha. So yesterday we touched on what the Buddha said in the Pabhasara Sutta. A few centuries later, like in the 4th century of the Common Era, we have a model of Buddhism developed that was called the Yogacara, that has become known as the Yogacara. The Yogacara is, well, it's the way of mental development. Chara meaning the way. Yoga, you could say, is mental development. So it's the way of mental development. It seems to have probably emerged, and I'm basing my understanding on Subhuti's understanding rather than I haven't studied Yogacara myself, so I'm basing it on Subhuti's understanding. He was saying that it's emerged probably in Kashmir, what's modern day Kashmir, and it was a model that is emerged from people who have been going deep into meditation and exploring the nature of consciousness from within. So again, we're looking at a subjective way of exploring the nature of reality. We're going into the first person experience deeper and deeper in meditation and looking for what is really going on and trying to uncover the radiance. And also the model is saying, yes, there's radiance, but it's also saying it's identifying the nature of the defilements, the clouds, the coverings. So it's a model. It's a model, and I want to re-emphasize that consciousness is not a thing. So yesterday I tried to say that we don't have a way of talking about consciousness because when we talk, our language is divided into subject and object. And when you give something a noun, when you refer to it, you've turned it into an object. But consciousness can't be turned into an object because consciousness is the awareness that knows the world of objects. It's the knowing aspect of experience, not the thing aspect of experience. So we don't really have a way of talking about it. And when we do talk about it, we have to give it names like consciousness, and we have to have models if we're going to go deeper into understanding. But it's really important to remember that they're only models, they're only as-ifs, and they're approximate, and they're not the thing itself, which isn't a thing itself. Okay, the other way of that Buddhism talks about it is that not only consciousness is not a thing, it's actually perhaps better to think of it as a succession of momentary mental events. Momentary mental events arising one after another. When we think of consciousness, if we're not careful, we think of a static entity, and it's not like that. It might be better to think of it as a succession of momentary events, mental events, a dynamic model. But actually, even that's not true, because the deepest level, at the level of the radiance, the luminous mind, that luminous mind isn't in time at all. So even the notion of momentary mental events, that's a temporal notion in time. When we get to that deepest level of consciousness, that luminosity, it isn't in time, just as it isn't in space. I was trying to illustrate that that inner space isn't the same as the three-dimensional outer space. Well, similarly, it's not in time, not in the way that we think of time. It's not in the past, present, and future. It's not like that. It's almost as if space and time are within it. It's more primary. That's at the very, very deepest level of consciousness, which we'll come to. But it might be better to think of consciousness as a succession of moments, of momentary events, because at least that stops us thinking of it as a static entity, a thing. Okay, I'm going to say a little bit more and then we'll have a break. So in the Yogacara model, I'm going to give you a very simplified version of it. The Yogacara actually isn't one doesn't have just one model. It's a whole school of thought that has different, it develops. And as I say, I'm not an expert in it. Some of the order members here, or some of you might be, you may know more about it and you can chip in later. What Subuti's done is he's just given a very simplified and highly interpretive model of the Yogacaras model. So he's given a simplified version of it. And that's what I'm going to do. So in the Yogacara model, we've got 3 levels or 3 layers to consciousness. And if I can operate the technology, I'm going to share my screen and show you the first level, and then we might have a break, and then we'll come back and have a look at other levels. So let me see if I can do this. Great, can you see that? So this is the first level in this model of consciousness. Now, Vijnana is the word for consciousness, the Sanskrit word for consciousness. And what you've got here is 6 blobs, 5 of them corresponding to the 5 senses, and then something called Manovijnana. So the 5 blobs corresponding to the 5 senses, eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, are according to this model, each of the senses has, as it were, a consciousness associated with it. Otherwise, it would not register. If you didn't have ear consciousness or eye consciousness, you would hear sounds or see images without registering them. So the consciousness is what allows us to experience the sounds or the visual impressions or the smells or the tastes or touch sensations. So each of the senses has associated with it. And remember, it's only a model. We're not talking literal truth. We're talking a way of understanding what's going on, and it's a useful model. So these 5 senses have, as it were, 5 consciousnesses associated with them: eye vijnana, ear vijnana, nose, tongue, and body vijnana, that receive the impressions from. So the eye vijnana receives visual sensations or visual stimulus through the eye, the sense apparatus, the organ, and then it's able to experience those visual sensations through the consciousness. Eye vijnana, is what enables the visual impressions to be experienced. And then mano vijnana. Mano means mind. Mano means mind. So mano vijnana is the 6th sense. In Buddhism, you don't just have the 5 senses, the 5 physical senses. Mind is also seen as a sense. And mind has its own sense objects like thoughts and images, visual images, and imaginative images, thoughts, feelings, etc., emotions. And what happens is that you've got some arrows going from the 5 physical senses into manovijnana. And what's happening there, what that's trying to illustrate, is that the mind consciousness coordinates all the 5 physical sense consciousnesses to give us the impression of a unified field of experience. So, for example, when I look at the screen, I've got some visual stimuli, but then if I reach out and touch the screen, I've got some tactile stimuli through the body vijnana, but the mind vijnana, the mano vijnana, coordinates it all, so that what those tactile sensations are also, as it were, associated with the visual sensations. That's how we make sense of the world. I was talking yesterday about having a great nephew. He's called Dhruv, and he's 6 months old. And I mean, I don't know anything about child development, but you can almost see that he's just learning how to coordinate all his visual senses, and it doesn't quite work yet. I mean, it took him a while, some weeks, to be able to, I don't know, move his hand into his mouth, you know, because that level of, he could probably see his hand and feel his hand, but didn't have the understanding that it was his hand that he could move, and things like that. Well, the Manovijnana coordinates it all and gives us a unified vision of the world, and coordinates the other five senses and their experience, their impressions. So let's, can I go back to, I'm going to stop sharing and go back to, hopefully you've got the picture. What I'd like us to do now is just have a tea break for 10 minutes, and then come back and see if there's any questions on anything I've said so far before we go a bit further. Yep. So, on anything I've said so far before we plunge into deeper waters. You can either call them out, or if you prefer, you can put them in chat. In fact, there was a question already in chat I've just noticed from Anne. Maybe I'll start with that because it's there. Anne says, but now that you have gone off on one, Jnanavaca, what do you mean by a unified field of consciousness? Thanks, Anne. What do I mean? Oh dear. What do I mean? So I was talking about, I was, wave, Anne, if you can. I can't, oh yeah, there you are, great. So I was talking about how in common sense terms, we think of a real fixed I, a subject, a real me in here, and then a real world that is as it appears out there. But when you, for example, look within, you don't find a static entity that is somehow an I. And when you look without, you know, you look around you in your room, you see a chair, for example, what you've got are visual impressions, colors and shapes. That is a visual impression that's happening in the mind. It's happening in consciousness, isn't it? In that, if we were not conscious, or if the eyes were closed, or if we couldn't see, there wouldn't be a visual impression. And then when you touch the chair, or when you touch the whatever it is, you get a tactile impression, you know, through the nerves in the hand, etc. But that's all happening in the mind as well. You know, somebody might have, if their consciousness was damaged, they could touch something, their nerves were working, but they wouldn't feel it. So all our senses are, all our sense impressions ultimately are being experienced in consciousness. Colors, shapes, but also smells, tastes, touches, and sounds. They're all happening in consciousness. We don't actually know what's out there independently of our consciousness. It's so when I see a color like red, red is happening as an experience in consciousness. Red isn't an independent thing out there, independent of my consciousness. Does that make sense? Um, uh, the same could be said of all of our senses. When we hear something, is the sound really out there? What, I mean, there's something going on out there, but the actual sound that I hear is being experienced in consciousness. I don't know what it's like out there. And if we could hear as a dog hears, we would hear sounds that we can't normally hear as human beings. There are other sounds out there that dogs can hear that we can't. Similarly, there are other visual things out there that we can't see. So, for example, we can't see infrared light. It's just not that our eyes are not designed to see infrared light, and that doesn't mean that it's not out there. So the world is not as it appears. That's what I'm trying to say. The appearances are happening through the senses and in consciousness. All we've got really is our awareness of the world as it appears to us. We don't know what's out there independently of our awareness of it. So not only is there no real fixed entity in here, out there, all we've got are appearances of objects. And by appearances, I want to include all five senses. I don't mean just visual appearances. I mean also touch sensations and smell sensations, etc. I include all of that in the word appearance. We've got appearances of objects. And so all the inner sense of me and my emotions and thoughts, and all the outer sense of the world of appearances and objects, all of that's happening in consciousness. All of it. So that's what I think I mean by unified field of consciousness. There is only just an awareness of experience. Some of it feels more like internal experience when I have a thought. Some of it feels more like it's an experience of something external to me. But actually, it's all just experienced in consciousness. It's a very counterintuitive way of thinking, but it is, I think, more true. Does that help, Anne? You can nod. That's it. I'll assume that that's helped anyway. Maybe it's confused more. That's right. Oh, good. Okay, let's take a couple more. So, Johanna, where are you, Johanna? Wave. Oh, yeah, Johanna, great. Johanna asked, how do you suggest working with unconscious defilements? So, really good question, and I'm not going to answer it just yet, Johanna, because I want to come on to it tomorrow and the next day. For now, I just want us to know that I'm trying to make us familiar, at least, with the model. And then I think the very pertinent question that you're asking is, well, so what? I mean, you're saying it more politely than that, but then the model needs to be used to we're trying to really trace back the radiance to the luminosity of the mind at its deepest. How do you do that? That will need working on the defilements. And how do we do that? How do we do that? So you could say it's the whole of the Buddhist path working on those defilements. But I'll say a little bit more specifically about them, hopefully tomorrow. Yeah. Pete G, where are you, Pete? Oh, yes, hello. Pete says, what distinction could you make between conscious and awareness, if any? Goodness, I'm sort of using the words rather synonymously and clumsily, maybe, but sometimes a distinction is made. Sometimes awareness is used to, I don't know, refer to perhaps this um, uh, unified field or the luminosity. Um, uh, but at the moment, I'm not making too much of a distinction. Yeah. After all, we're only using words, aren't we? And we're also trying to remember that the words are not pointing to real things. They're pointing to some way of describing this experience of being alive. Susie, Susie, where are you, Susie? Hello, Susie. You're at the bottom of my screen. Could you say everything is co-happening? Um, like, do you mean like outside of time? Yeah. Oh goodness, I don't know, but it is more mysterious than I think we think. Bante, I don't know if you've read Bante's memoirs, Susie, but in his first set of memoirs, as a boy, as a young man, he has some experiences um, when he's in Tooting in London of precognition. Uh, uh, Prayer, do you remember those? He he seems to recall. He seems to know what's going to happen half an hour in half an hour's time, and very vividly, like he's working in some office for the toll board or something, I think, and he knows who's going to come into the office and exactly what they're going to say in half an hour's time. He can he and he sort of sees it, and it then unfolds exactly as he'd seen it. They come in and they say things, etc. And I had the good fortune a few times to study with Bante, and we were talking about this experience. And I was saying, so what's happening, Bante? What does that mean? And he said, well, it's as if consciousness it's not bounded in time, it's not in time. And in a sense, I mean, he didn't say more, so I don't know, but in a sense, um, this unfoldment of things in time is not the deepest reality. It's how things appear to us, but it's not the deepest reality. Um, um, I don't know what that means. Um, I was recently watching a documentary about the physicist David Bohm. Um, uh, um, David Bohm was a well, he was a sort of he was younger than Einstein. He was a sort of student of Einstein, and Einstein regarded David Bohm as his spiritual son, which is an interesting turn of phrase to use from a physicist, isn't it? Um, Bohm was his spiritual son, and David Bohm had a theory. He died in, I think, 1992 or so. He had a theory that underlying this surface reality of objects and time and space and things, um, underlying that is a deeper order of reality. And this is very similar to the model that we're going to unfold, that I'm going to try and unfold, that there's a deeper order of reality. And in that deeper order of reality, things are not separate and they're not in time. But what happens is that the moment to moment, that deeper order, that hidden order, is unfolding in time and space and in this world of phenomena. Uh, and then moment to moment, he says it's folding back into this deeper order as well. Um, and this deeper order is perhaps what we mean by this luminous mind. Um, and if it's not in time and space, in a certain sense, from that perspective, everything is always happening. Everything, the past, the present, the future are not separate. this unfoldment isn't really real. But I don't know what that really means. Artapriya looks shocked. Oh no, you're only shocked because Artasides joined you. That's good. I thought you were shocked at what I was saying, and then I was going to have to unmute you and see if you could explain things better. But if anybody can, please do unmute yourself and help me out. Anyway, I'm sorry I can't say any more, Susie. We've touched on things that are beyond, not even just beyond language, they're beyond conceptualization. Very good. So, Artapriya does want to say something.
Just interesting, you know, that series you mentioned on Netflix, Surviving Death. In the first episode, people who had near-death experiences experienced sort of eternity in a moment, didn't they?
Yes, they do.
I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah,
just
yeah.
that.
And then you have Blake's vision, don't you? To see the world in a grain of sand and an eternity in an hour. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and heaven in a wild flower. Is that right? Or something like that. There's that mystics and poets and visionaries have always said that they've experienced something beyond this world of time, this temporal existence. Yeah. So Shubhanaga, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it, or shall I read it out?
I don't mind. I could read it out if you like.
And you read it out, just to get a change of my voice.
Well, I'll just read what I've written. So, yeah, it's just Subhuti says somewhere, I think it's in the lecture series on the system of Dharma life, about this this terminology of grasper and grasped being more useful to us than subject object, because there is the reality that there is these two poles of experience, but actually the unhelpful bit is the grasping. That's right. Wondered if you had any thoughts on that, actually. Yeah,
I think that's really good. Grahaka and graha is I don't know which way around they are now, but anyway, there is grasper and grasped rather than subject and object. So grasper corresponds to the I, the subject, and the grasped is the corresponds to the object. And yeah, this model brings out that we're clinging. We're definitely this construct of separate me and a separate world. We're clinging. It's caused by clinging, and then we cling to it. It leads on actually to the next bit of my little talk, and I'm going to move on if I may, and then Jules has got a question as well. But maybe Jules, can I come back to you? Just because I want to move on while we've got this grasper and grasped thing that Shubhanaga's brought up, because I wanted to come on to that. And then also I want you to break up into groups, and I want you to have time in groups. So hold on to your question, Jules. Well, it's in the chat, so that's good. So look, the next thing I wanted to talk about, we've got in this Yogacara model, I said there were 3 layers to mind, and we've just looked at the first level or layer, and that includes the 6 consciousnesses, those 6 blobs that I was illustrating on Key Point. I've just learned how to use Key Point this morning. I did that this morning. I leapt out of bed and did that presentation with a little help from my friends, but I'm very pleased with it. So the next level I'm going to share with you. Let's see if we can do this. Okay, so we've already seen that. And now, ta-da, you've got another level of consciousness Can you all see that? Called Manas, and I've put it in blue to differentiate it because it's a deeper level. It's a deeper level. And Manas is another, it's the level of consciousness where all the delusion lies. It's the I consciousness. It's the sense of self that we have comes from the Manas. Now, this is a model, remember. So in Buddhism, what we're saying is that I, the sense of self, is a construct. It's not just a cognitive construct. It's not just an idea. It's really felt. It's a sort of emotio-cognitive construct. We feel it. It's an instinct. It's not just an idea, but it is a construct, and it's below the surface. It's below our normal consciousness, so we don't notice it. We don't notice that we're doing it. We don't notice that we're constructing this self-sense. It's below the surface. We all have it. It's innate in us. We sometimes notice it, a little bit notice it, when we're in an unfamiliar situation and we suddenly feel a bit disoriented and we struggle to identify what's going on and who we are. Sometimes, I don't know, if you've passed out and you come round, it can take a few moments to sort of orientate yourself and to, I'm going to go back. Hopefully that's that. It's just a blob, so you don't need it all up all the time. You know, sometimes when you come back, you pass out and then you come back, there's a moment of disorientation, and then you have to gather yourself again. It's like mind gathers itself and says, oh yes, this is me and I'm here. I once passed out in the cinema. I have a habit of, I used to have a habit of going to see films that were not good for me. You know, if they were very violent or something, I used to think, oh, that's fine, and horror films and all the rest of it. But actually, I can't stand the sight of blood. and I particularly can't stand the sight of somebody being hurt, tortured, or, you know, deliberately hurt. And so I used to have, as a young man, this very embarrassing habit of passing out in the cinema. Once I went on a date and I was trying to impress somebody and I just passed out. It was so embarrassing. Another time I didn't mean to share all this, but once I was with Maitreya Raja and we went to the cinema and I passed out with him. We'd gone to see a film called Sunshine, which we didn't know what it was. We just walked in, and I think we were in Sheffield on some sort of course, and we just walked into the, and anyway, it turned out it was all very lovely. It was all about this family, da 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 da. But then suddenly the Second World War happens, and they're a Jewish family, and they're in the Holocaust, and it all becomes very, very traumatic and horrible. And anyway, I pass out, and the next thing I know, all the lights are on. The film's stopped being shown. I'm lying on the aisle on my back. Everybody's gathered around me. An ambulance is on its way. It was the most embarrassing thing. But anyway, for a moment, you wake up. You come round. I mean, I didn't forgive Maitreya Raja for a long time. I thought, what on earth are you doing? Of course, I'd have come round in just a few moments. But he panicked, and anyway, it's all very embarrassing. So when you come round, you have a certain sense, I mean, of the mind reforming its sense of a sense of me and a sense of world. That's a little hint of the manas working. But ordinarily, it's below the level of ordinary consciousness and we don't notice it. And what Shubhanaga was saying, the grasper and grasped, is really important because we have a thirst in us for identity. We want to be someone. We want to be a being with an identity. We have a thirst for that very, very deeply. And that's the manas's thirst. It's where the I consciousness comes from. It's more that the manas is the consciousness that seeks identity. So Buddha said the word he uses is ahankara, Ahamkara. It's the I maker, the ahankara. And that quest for identity, for a stable identity that is doomed, but we try really hard. We say, I am this, I am that. At the most basic level, we say, I am I. But then we have other identities, don't we? We have identities to do with, I don't know, gender and how else do we identify? Well, I'm going to ask you to think about this in a moment, so I'm not going to give you too many clues, but we have social identities. We create an identity for ourselves in the world in relation to other beings, other people, socio-political identities even. We might identify with our job. I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, I'm a this, I'm a that. That's a way of having an identity. These identities are relatively superficial, but actually the grasping behind them can be very deep. So that if I've identified with my job and then I lose my job, that can be really traumatic. Etc., etc. So I'm going to ask us, this is the manas behind the scenes of those 6 sense consciousnesses. There's the manas making an I. It's doing this identity thing all the time. So I'm going to ask us to go into groups now. And for 20 minutes, I want us to maybe 15 minutes. Oh, I don't know. Let's have 20 minutes. Let's have 20 minutes where we discuss different identities that we are attached to, ways that we identify who we are, and particularly those that we feel quite attached to, where the grasping is quite strong. Yeah, socio-political identities, maybe religious identities, maybe career, whatever. Biological identities even. How do we construct this sense of who I am, me, and particularly the ones that we cling to quite deeply, that we really think are me? Does that make sense as a question? I think you'll be all right. Okay, so let's go off into groups and come back at around 12. Once again, I hope you had enough time to each at least say something. I'm aware that there's other questions in the chat, but I'd like to just hear from a few people what you came up with, or what you were, if you're willing to share, what you feel, how you make an identity, and particularly identities that you're more attached to. Anybody be willing or prepared to share that? You don't have to. I'd love to hear from you. Oh, Priyadaka. Hello, Priyadaka. Nice to see you.
Hi, Jnanavaca. Good to be with you. I thought our group was fascinating. What different people said about identity, and you know, I could recognise a fair bit of what people said within myself. So one person was saying they're not quite sure what to identify with, and yeah, part of me can say, yeah. Well, what do you identify? What exactly is this thing? There's quite a thing to puzzle out. Another person was saying about identifying with negative, as it were, negative aspects of ourselves, negative qualities, but very hard to let go of. And I do that as well. I'm quite happy. Well, I'm not. I'm slightly embarrassed, but I'm likely to say my bad sides, and that's who I am. And if someone was to say, "Oh no, you're okay," I'd feel, "Oh no, I am those things." I'd feel uneasy if I didn't have my negative identifications.
What am I going to do with my hatred?
Yeah. So yeah, fascinating, different way. Really bigger and smaller things that we identify with, and they're all equally important and a puzzle to see. And then, of course, how we change, or at least perhaps how our identity changes when we're with other people, with our friends.
Yes.
And good friends may not quite allow us to identify with who we sort of want to identify with, and there's a whole shift there. So yeah, it's fascinating.
But also that we can be different people with in different contexts.
Yeah. So thank you to my group for their
thank you for
offerings.
Very good. Anybody else want to share thoughts, reflections on identity? Oh, Kamalamati's waving. Hello, Kamalamati.
Hello. Yeah, I'll just sort of sum up, or gather together a little bit of themes in a way, shared things that came up in our group quite strongly.
Yeah.
One was around where we come from, either our nationality or our region, even north-south divide in Britain, Scottish and or British or European. How do we, those things were being mentioned, and also career, our profession or our chosen work, and that can be quite strong. That came across quite strongly from some of the people in our group. Yes,
and of course, there's nothing wrong with identity at a certain level, is there? There's nothing wrong with saying, okay, well, I'm from, so for example, in my case, I'm Indian, my parents are Indian, but I was born in Kenya, so I'm from Africa, but I identify as British. There's nothing wrong with having identities at a certain level, or career, if you've got a job or a vocation or whatever, it's very easy to. It's not a bad thing to say, yes, I'm a nurse or whatever, teacher or whatever I am, or a banker even, or whatever I am. It's not. It's just that they're not absolutes. They're relative identities. They're relatively true, but in the end, they don't define us completely. How can they? How can a job define who I really am, particularly when I lose my job or I change careers or whatever? Even my national identity. Nations change, don't they? I mean, I can remember a nation called Yugoslavia, for example, and it's changed now. I can remember a nation called Czechoslovakia, and that's changed now. And national boundaries are not really so static, and etc. etc. They're relatively real. They work at a particular kind of common sense level, but they're not absolutes. They don't go very deep. Yeah, thanks, Kamalamati, and your group. Atapriya.
Just hearing you talk, I remember a time when I stopped being the chair of the Manchester Centre, and somebody bumped into me in town, and they said to me, "Didn't you used to be somebody?" And I was under the impression I was still somebody, but I'd been identified with a particular kind of role, and because I wasn't doing that role anymore, I wasn't to anybody. So yeah, I agree with you, because sometimes we say, don't we, when we meet somebody, what do you do?
Yeah.
And then we've got them, haven't we?
Yeah.
And it can be a useful starting point, but it can kind of limit them.
Yeah.
Somebody in my group didn't want to be labeled in any way. She's it's been a thing for her not to be kind of labelled in any particular way.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
It can be a good thing. Yes, I can recall when I used to be chair of the London Buddhist Centre, and when I became the chair, I made a real conscious effort and a sort of promise to myself that I didn't want to identify with it. I didn't want to. It was a job. It was a role that I was playing for a while, for a number of years, but it didn't define me. And I'm really glad I did that, because when I stepped away from being chair, when I stood down, it felt very easy. In fact, blissfully freeing for a while. Yeah. Maybe one more. Yes, Dharmanata's waving.
I missed a little bit at the beginning because I'm identifying as an over 60-year-old who had to go to the loo. So we did. Yeah, we had a really strong. It was a really strong group in terms of our professions. With social worker, nurse.
Right.
Currently currently a psychotherapist, and I was a police officer for 30 years. So I was really interested in the way that these strong identities, there's often a big element of, I don't know what you'd call it, sort of collusion. It's a real strong group identity, and a lot of positive things attached to those. And we were also talking about what happens when suddenly, or even if it's planned, you are suddenly not that anymore, and how there's almost a flavour of grief, of loss attached to that, really, really strongly. And it's almost, I guess, I mean, the group didn't say this, and I didn't bring it up, but there's almost a flavour of a refuge being removed when you lose this particular identity.
That's right.
And I've also been wondering whether I am, as I go about in the world, whether I am reinforcing, unconsciously probably, reinforcing somebody's identity for them in an unhelpful way.
Right.
Yeah.
We can relate to each other through those chosen identities and reinforce them for each other. I mean, one reason why I think why solitary retreats are so valuable, one reason is that we're not having to be anybody for anybody, and even for ourselves. So when I stood down as chair of the LBC, I went on a long solitary. I did a 6-month solitary, and for those 6 months, I pretended to have died. I sort of tried to sort of imagine that I just died to all my identities, to all my life, to all my relationships, that I just let them all go. And because I was on retreat and because I was in positive states, it wasn't traumatic or frightening or whatever. It was incredibly freeing. So I wasn't a son and a brother and a community member and a chair, or I wasn't actually any of those things. On the solitary retreat, I could be completely free. And in meditation, what I was also trying to let go of was the deeper identity that is a sense of I am, not I am X, but I am at all, as an entity. And it's incredibly freeing to the extent that I could let go of that. It's absolutely joyous. So solitary retreats can be a very useful way of positively letting go of identities. And you're right, Dhammanata, we tend to reinforce identities for each other. People around us will relate in a particular way, and family, for example, family relationships, people often relate through the family identity, don't they? My mum is my mum, as it were. Interestingly, when she died, my mum, I tried to really just wish her well as a human being or as a consciousness, not as my mother. But, you know, she was another stream of consciousness that had taken form in this particular life. And we'd got this karmic connection, this biological connection as mother and son. But from a dharmic perspective, that's not who she is, and that's not who I am. Not deeply, not really. We're something much more mysterious than that we don't really have language for. But I've been trying to think of myself as a stream of consciousness that has crystallized in a particular form in this lifetime, and will, you know, be freed of the form after death. So I think we can explore this concept of identity at lots of different levels, but each of them, whatever level you're exploring it at, whether it's career, profession, national identity, gender identity, racial identity, relationship identity, whether you're a partner or a son or a daughter or whatever you are, if you start to loosen those attachments, there's a freedom that can come. If you start to consciously say, yes, that's a role that I play, and I'm happy to play that role. It's a useful identity sometimes, but it's not essentially true. It's not essentially what I am. And Priyadatta was talking about identifying with negative qualities. Well, that's not so useful. So see if we can start to, some identities are going to be relatively useful, some are relatively not useful, and we could start to unhook from them consciously through reflection, through solitary retreats, through study like we're doing. See if we can hold our identities a little bit more loosely, sit loose to them, because they're changing. They're not fixed. Nothing about us is fixed. And the more that we try and fix our identities, the more suffering we will experience when they break down. So Dharmanatha was just saying, you know, there can be a loss, a sense of loss of identity when, I don't know, when you're made redundant or you change jobs or there's a divorce or whatever, or you grow old. You know, if you identify as a young person and you start to grow old, you know, Arthur City's now 45, you know, so what's happening to his identity? It's in flux. So the more we cling to our identities in any sense, the more pain we cause ourselves, because the more we're denying the real fluid nature of life, the flowing nature of life. The more we can flow and not hold on and grip tightly, the more creatively we can just pick up one identity when it's useful and put it down when it's not. You know, so if you're a psychotherapist, when you're at work seeing a client, it's useful to pick up that identity and relate from it. You know, and then you, I don't know, you go home at the end of the day or whatever, and it's not useful to keep holding on to it. That's a healthier way of being. But of course, the manus, to go back to the manus, is the, in this model, that's the maker of identity, the I maker. And at the deepest level, it's not about career or race or gender even. At the deepest level, the deepest identity is just having a sense that I exist as a being, as a separate being from the rest of the universe, rather than what's truer, which is that we're a flowing part of the rest of reality. We're a flowing set of processes in a universe of processes. There's no real edges to us. But what Manus does is Manus says, no, this is me and this is not me. So this is me, and it normally takes the body and says, oh yes, this body, that's me. Sometimes it says this body, that's mine. And then that becomes painful when the body doesn't do what you want it to do. You know, when my hair falls out, if I've identified with that hair being mine and also a full head of hair being me, that's really, you know, that's disconcerting. It's disconcerting anyway, but it's more disconcerting the more I've identified with it. So the manus takes, often it takes the body, and it takes our sense of thoughts and emotions and personality and tendencies, all those habits of consciousness, and it says, oh, that's all me. That's me. And then it fixes it and then says, that's a fixed thing. And then everything outside of the body, that's not me. No, that's the world. That's not me. That's not, but some of it I'm going to make mine. This house, this car, I'm going to make mine. Oh, and that person, that's not me. But then sometimes I make them mine, in that that's my partner, that's my child, that's my parent. The manus does all of that. It's an instinct. It goes back to Shubhanaga's grasper and grasped. The manus is a grasping thing. It grasps onto this sense of me, and then it as the grasper, and then it grasps onto the world and makes it mine or not mine, which is a very different way of being to this what I was calling this sort of unified field of consciousness, where we're moving in a fluid way. There's unfolding processes and experiences, none of them really me or mine. And it's a long way from this luminous mind that we're trying to open up to, this radiance, which doesn't have any boundary of me and mine in it. It's a transcendental consciousness. So do you see these levels starting to emerge, and how identity is so key? I'm going to start wrapping up shortly, so we'll finish by 12:30. But I was just looking at the questions, and Jules, you've got something about unconscious defilements. I'm going to come back to that unconscious defilements tomorrow or the next day, if that's okay. Vidyasaki, you had something about, are we born with manus, or is it something we construct post-birth, and is it related to karma? So that's the one I want to finish on. So according to the tradition, we're born with it. In fact, it was there before birth. We're born because of it. It's because in previous lives, we had this tendency to grasp onto an identity that after death, we continued doing that and became born into this life. That habit of grasping onto an identity, from the traditional perspective, that's been going on for innumerable, countless lifetimes. So it's a very strong habit to grasp onto an identity. And we're born because of it. It's innate in us. The very fact that we're born means that we must have had it. Yeah. There are two influences actually from previous lives. There's one which is the thing that I've just said, which is this tendency to hold on to an identity. That delusion that I am a me, that comes from many, well, countless previous lives. But also what comes from previous lives is how we've acted, that the forces of karma are operating, and how we've acted from this identity in previous lives, whether we've been skillful or unskillful, that also carries over into this life. So there are two influences from previous lives. One is the basic delusion of being someone, and the second influence is past karmic, the fruits of past karmic actions, whether they're skillful or unskillful, or a mixture, of course. Does that make sense? They're the two perfumings, the two vasanas that come into this, that we come into this life with. One perfuming is this tendency to grasp an identity, and the other perfuming is from past karma. And then in this lifetime, we're always making new karma. You know, we're acting all the time, and that can be skillful or less skillful. That's going to influence how consciousness unfolds in the future. But also, we're gripping onto a sense of self. And the more tightly we grip, the more we reinforce that habit of gripping, of grasping. So Dharma practice is about, well, first of all, seeing if we can loosen that grasping onto me, and at the same time, act more and more skillfully, create more and more skillful karma through acts of kindness, through acts of generosity, etc. And if we act more and more skillfully, if we act more unselfishly, we're also loosening the self-centered grasping onto me. But it's the manas. Let me show you the manas again, because I haven't shown you it for a while, and I managed to, I was quite pleased with it. There it is. It's the manas, which is below the level of ordinary consciousness, which is said to be responsible for the grasping onto a sense of me, and then, of course, also differentiating and saying, this is not me. So it divides the world into me and not me, mine and not mine. And it's deluded. And although, to go back to the previous model of defilements clouding the radiance, the clouds, it's the manas that has the defilements. And so tomorrow we'll come on to some of those defilements, but I also want to look at the radiance tomorrow. So it's the manas that is responsible for all our problems. The thing is that the manas has formed from countless previous lives. So it's not just in this life, we're born with it. The defilements are innate, some of them. And then we can add to them. We can really darken the clouds by acting more unskillfully, or we can start to thin the clouds by acting more through metta and awareness and so forth. But ultimately, we have to somehow penetrate the clouds, and that's done through wisdom, and let the radiance sort of break through. Just like when the sun breaks through clouds, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to break through the clouds and then see that, there is a sun behind it all. And maybe that's who we really are. Maybe we're not the clouds. Maybe we're not the all the identities that you've come up with. Maybe that's not who we really are. Maybe who we really are at our deepest is this radiant luminosity, which is also the nature of metta, the nature of love. Maybe that's who we really are. That's our true identity, which is in a sense a no identity, because it's not separate from the rest of everybody and the rest of what we call reality. All boundaries in that radiance have dissolved. There is just radiant awareness, which is also love. So I'll leave it there for today. We've got lots to maybe think about, particularly this question of how do I identify? You know, our current social sort of world is very much about celebrating our differences and identities. And I think that there's, of course, value in that. But Buddhism would say, let's hold our identities very loosely and lightly. You know, whatever identities they are, gender, race, career, whatever they are, they're relatively true. They're relatively real. They don't go as deep as the radiance. And that's what's going to free us, that luminous mind, free us from the dukkha of existence. Okay, so hopefully come back tomorrow, and I've got another diagram, so don't miss that.
I hope you're not identifying with your diagrams too